because it's a whole lot easier for them to cut, for institutions to cut the part-time faculty than it is to cut the full-time faculty who have tenure and have to go through all sorts of hoops to cut them. So they're seeing their, in a lot of cases, they're seeing those part-time positions dry up. And their response has basically been to increase the size of the gen ed courses and the other courses. And I think one of my concerns as I look at this sort of larger ecology of how we get students to choose to major in this system is that if we aren't going to have folks in these part-time positions and that we're simply going to increase class sizes and make these courses much less appealing, I think that's a significant concern in terms of its long-term effect on the number of majors and over the larger cycle. If the majors start to drop, that our jobs are going to begin to drop too. Now the second trend that's really helped sustain a lot of those job increases is a significant increase in the number of retirements. Now, when I got in 1988, part of this assumption that there was going to be a big increase in employment and this shortage of PhDs was premised on the idea that there was going to be a significant amount of retirement from folks who'd gotten into higher ed and started teaching in the 60s and early 70s. But one of the changes they didn't really take into account was that they'd done away with policies for mandatory retirement in 1986. I mean, it's official federal policy. And as you can see, the effect of that was that folks stayed significantly longer in history teaching roles. And we had a significant spike. So a lot of those folks who normally would have retired ended up staying into their 60s and even their 70s. And so for a time, over 50% in the mid-90s, over 50% of these departments had folks who were past the age of 55. And so that helped to, I think, reduce, it's really helped to sustain some of that sense of job crisis. The other issue, of course, was that there was a significant increase in the number of people receiving PhDs in the 90s as well. One of my sort of longer-term concerns, and sort of one of the things I was trying to push to departments in this last job market article, is that as you see the trend coming back down in terms of the number of people who are even approaching retirement age, as a long-term issue in terms of admission of new doctoral students, I think that's a significant concern, and I think something that needs to be taken into account. I think sort of then looking back over into the supply side of the issue, I think the supply side is much more complex as well than simply saying, you know, if we can cut some programs, if departments would decrease the number of students that they're accepting, that would simply solve a lot of the problems. One of the issues is we've had an increase in the number of PhD programs that are actually conferring doctoral programs. Really, we've had an increase of 32 new programs since 1990, and only 6 have canceled their programs over that same span. So as you can see, we've had a general increase in the number of PhD programs, which adds to the number of people who are coming into doctoral programs and that sort of thing. I think one of the things to keep in mind, however, is rather than simply, I think there's a tendency, certainly it happened in the 70s, to focus on these new programs and say if we just get rid of those or we stop those, that would be a significant part of the problem. But in part of the larger ecology of how we, where these PhDs go, most of these PhDs are not going into the larger national market that's being interviewed here today. Most of those folks are actually being employed within a fairly local, regional market at places that faculty, you know, a new PhD from Harvard or some other elite university is not likely to go to. And so these new PhD programs are really serving a very specific market that is not, in some ways, I think in many ways, depressing or affecting the market for a lot of the sort of folks who would come to an AHA meeting and be looking for jobs. I think that's an important factor to keep in mind. But I think one of the other issues that's a difficulty in terms of trying to track and trying to say something really determinative about how to understand the job market is the issue of how many people are actually going to come out of a PhD program after they're admitted. And I have to say, I think one of the scandals of our discipline is, and really, and I talk to other disciplines, it's sort of the same all over, is that PhD programs simply don't keep any real track of their students, what's happening to them, and beyond the basic requirements of their institutional expectations for the different stages. They don't keep any substantive track of where their PhDs are going and how long they're staying, what their attrition rates are. And so I've been trying over the past few years to try and develop some data on this, and as sort of a guesstimate, a fairly informed guesstimate, I'm not 100% confident in these numbers, but this is the best estimate I can get. It's important to keep in mind that only about 55% of the people who matriculate into a PhD program are actually going to finish. I think that's something that's understated in way too many programs as a piece of information that folks should have. After about the 5-year point, you'll see folks start to move into transitional positions. And, if you view it as the full cohort, by transitional employment, I mean positions that are postdocs, part-time, traditional part-time employment, those sorts of things. But, jobs within academia, which are not tenure-track positions. Beyond that, a certain percentage will move into full-time tenure-track employment. But in the end, I think only about 25% of the people who matriculate into a PhD program ultimately come out within 10 years with a tenure-track PhD program. Which again gets me back to what I see as sort of the scandal of many PhD programs in terms of they're training their students for a job market that most of them are not ultimately going to end up employed in. And then a significant percentage are going to end up in non-academic employment. Think about, I think, when you get to year 10, you've got about 17% of folks who are still, departments report to me that they're still they still classify them as students, but I find it really hard to believe that most of those folks are actually going to finish. And so generally, I estimate that about 10% of folks are going to probably end up in long-term, what I call transitional employment, but in most cases, if you're this sort of permanent freeway flyer position, that's not transitional anymore. And then about 40% are going to end up in non-academic employment outside of academia. And I think one of the disappointments I've experienced both in the 90s and then again today is that usually what happens when we enter a job cycle like this is that the PhD programs call me, as they have over this past few months, to say, can you give us some advice on how we can hone our students' teaching skills and what sort of employment opportunities there are outside of academia. But invariably, these things happen. They come to me, they ask me for this advice, I give it to them, and then they go off, and the job cycle goes back into a fairly nice state of equilibrium, and it seems to be forgotten. And so, after you've been there for 20 years and you've experienced this over and over again, it does begin to seem a little bit dysfunctional. I think one of the concerns I've had, we had this Committee on Graduate Education do a report on this about a decade ago, and basically laid out all these issues, and typically the only people who seemed to really read that report and take it very seriously were a few small mid-tier programs, and then a number of the new programs who used it as a blueprint for how to set up new PhD programs. So anyway, I hope this provides, I know, again, this is a sort of a massive overview of how the situation looks, and it doesn't really connect to the realities of the way most of you are experiencing the job market, but I hope